seen a lot of news about the growing questioning environment, but what I'm trying to look at here is where does safety come up in the broader look at where the confidence problem is. And again, safety rises to the top. We developed a vaccine confidence index, which we've been running for 5 years, 67 countries in 2016, and I was actually surprised at Europe being so acutely skeptical when it came to safety. I knew other countries were having some issues, but it was quite acute in Europe. When we try to disaggregate that by different kinds of reasons, safety is the biggest issue. Safety is the biggest issue. Fear of side effects, low sense of risk. The other thing that's a trend and an issue is not just confidence in providers, but confidence of healthcare providers. We have a very wobbly health professional front line that is starting to question vaccines and the safety of vaccines. That's a huge problem because to this day, any study I've seen, and we're constantly looking on any studies in this space, still the most trusted person on any study I've seen globally is the healthcare provider. And if we lose that, we're in trouble. We've talked about it earlier. Some of the challenges are when the frontline professionals are starting to question, or they don't feel like they have enough confidence about the safety to stand up to it to the person asking them the questions. I mean, most medical school curriculums, even nursing curriculums, I mean, in medical school, you're lucky if you have a half day on vaccines, never mind keeping up to date with all this. In medical school, you're lucky if you have a half day on vaccines, never mind keeping up to date with all this. I've spent a lot of time talking, particularly in the last 6 months, with tech companies, Facebook, WhatsApp, Pulsar, Twitter, Instagram, WeChat, Weibo. They have a lot of fingers pointing at them to fix the misinformation problem. But it's not so simple. One, the biggest problem is a lot of it's not misinformation. Our problem is, as we've heard in the last 48 hours, that there's not anything 100%. And what actually can legally, without creating a censorship thing, can we absolutely say this is misinformation? Because we have a lot of ambiguity in the safety field, and we have to come to terms with that. So we have to think about it differently than deleting misinformation, but building trust so people are willing to put up with a certain amount of risk because they believe in it enough. They believe in our work, what we're doing, and that it's in their interest. One of our biggest challenges, I think now, is getting rid of the term anti-vax, getting rid of the hostile language, and starting to have more conversations, to be open to questions, to make people feel like they shouldn't be judged when they're asking questions. As crazy as those questions might seem to you, as stupid as they might seem, or as ignorant as they might seem, we can't risk losing another person's confidence in safety right now. I think that one of our biggest challenges is, as Bob said this morning or yesterday, we're in a unique position in human history where we've shifted the human population to vaccine-induced, to dependency on vaccine-induced immunity. And that's on the great assumption that populations would cooperate. And for many years, people lined up. The 6 vaccines, people were there. They saw the reason. We're in a very fragile state now. We have developed a world that is dependent on vaccinations. We don't have a choice but to make that effort.
My name is Marion Gruber. I'm with the Office of Vaccines at the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, U.S. Food and Drug Administration. And as I was reading the paper that I was part of writing, I would like to sort of underscore a few points made in that paper and also reflect on some of the issues presented to us regarding novel vaccine platforms. So I think vaccines, regardless whether they are generated using new and innovative technology or whether more standard conventional technologies are applied, they do require safety surveillance and monitoring that is specifically tailored to the vaccine that is under consideration using available pharmacovigilance systems. So in other words, the risk management plan for each particular vaccine will need to take into the consideration the pre-licensure safety database, potential safety signals that may have been identified during pre-licensure clinical safety trials, other perhaps even theoretical safety concerns, and also need to take into consideration the disease to be prevented, the target population, and the proposed indication in order to really inform risk management.
Adjuvants are added to vaccines for many reasons, but primarily to make the vaccines work. And as we enter the next decade, and we're trying to make vaccines against malaria, TB, HIV, GBS, RSV, it is extremely likely that these are going to require adjuvants. And yet, every time we add an adjuvant to a vaccine, the people that are using the vaccine look at it, and if there's an adverse event, we know what they're going to say. It's the adjuvant that caused that adverse event. So the challenge that we have in front of us is, how do we build confidence in this? And the confidence, first of all, comes from the regulatory agencies. I look to Marianne. When we add an adjuvant, it's because it is essential. We do not add adjuvants to vaccines because we want to do so. But when we add them, it adds to the complexity. And I give courses every year on how do you develop vaccines, how do you make vaccines. And the first lesson is, while you're making your vaccine, if you can avoid using an adjuvant, please do so. Lesson 2 is, if you're going to use an adjuvant, use one that has a history of safety. And lesson 3 is, if you're not going to do that, think very carefully.
It seems to me that adjuvants multiply the immunogenicity of the antigens that they are added to, and that is their intention. It seems to me they multiply the reactogenicity in many instances, and therefore it seems to me that it is not unexpected if they multiply the incidence of adverse reactions that are associated with the antigen, but may not have been detected through lack of statistical power in the original studies. Now, I wonder if this thinking is correct, and if it is, whether this has some implications for the way we do pharmacovigilance. Because one vaccine that has one antigen and an adjuvant, and another vaccine that has a different antigen and no adjuvant, the reason for the difference is not immediately obvious.
The primary concern, though, usually is systemic adverse events rather than local adverse events. And we tend to get in the phase 2 and the phase 3 studies quite good data on the local reactogenicity. But this is not the major health concern. The major health concern which we are seeing are accusations of long-term effects. So what we have to bear in mind is that we don't use adjuvants by themselves. The adjuvant is used in combination with an antigen. And an adjuvant may give quite different responses depending on which antigen it is combined with. So the fact that an adjuvant is shown to be safe with one antigen might give a different response with another antigen because of other things that are with that second antigen, including impurities. So to come back to this, I'm going to once again point to the regulators. It comes down to ensuring that we conduct the phase 2 and the phase 3 studies with adequate size and with appropriate measurement.
It's also the subject population that you administer the adjuvant to, because we've seen data presented to us where an adjuvant, a particular adjuvant added to a vaccine antigen did really nothing when administered to a certain population, and it's usually the elderly, compared to administering the same formulation to younger age strata. So these are things which need to be considered as well and further complicate safety and effectiveness evaluation of adjuvants combined with vaccine antigens.
Coming down the pike, maybe relatively quickly, is a new target population for us in vaccines, and that's maternal immunization. And these are women who are pregnant, who will have all kinds of adverse events associated with their pregnancy. Part of the problem is that we don't have a strong enough pharmacoepidemiologic baseline in the target populations that we're studying to be able to say, is this an expected adverse event due to pregnancy, or is this related to the vaccine? So I do think an investment in that kind of epidemiologic baseline is going to be critically important if we don't want to derail some of our maternal immunization vaccines as they go into low resource settings.
As we were having the discussions, something was just going through my mind which I will need clarification. Outside vaccines, for instance, we take Septrin and Fancida, they potentiate each other. And there are so many other drugs like that. I cast back my mind to our situation in Nigeria, where at 6 weeks, 10 weeks, 14 weeks, a child is being given different antigens from different companies. And these vaccines have different adjuvants, different preservatives, and so on. You go again to 9 months. Currently, the child at 9 months will receive main A. That same child will receive yellow fever. That same child will receive measles vaccine. Something crosses my mind. Is there a possibility of these adjuvants, preservatives, cross-reacting amongst themselves? Have there ever been a study on the possibility of cross-reactions from the panel members that you can share the experience with us? Because this is one thing that I'm also crossing my mind. Going back home, this is an area that we'll need to work with the regulatory agency. Let's even see what is happening. Is there any possibility? So we need guidance from the panel members, whether there's ever been any study on these cross-reactions of multiple antigens from different companies given to a child at the same time. What counsel do you have for us? Thank you.
This is a very important question because in general, the clinical trials with any particular new product frequently is done just by itself, and then ultimately, frequently the regulators will ask if that vaccine could be added to the routine immunization program, and so frequently a trial is done with that new vaccine in addition to the regular regimen. But your question is almost kind of the next step, because in real practice, frequently there are multiple vaccines from different manufacturers that then may be received at a different age schedules, etc. And if you take a look at the immunization schedule over the last, let's say, 15, 20 years in high-income countries, as well as in low-resource countries, the schedule has gotten more and more complex. Clearly. And so if you take a look at the exposure, what we call the vaccine exposure, in the typical adverse event report to a spontaneous reporting system in any country, you'll see that increase in heterogeneity of those different vaccine exposures, especially if you take the manufacturer into account. Now, the only way to tease that out is if you had a large population database like the Vaccine Safety Data Link, as well as some of the other national databases that are coming into being, where the actual vaccine exposure is tracked down to that level of specificity of who is the manufacturer, what is the lot number, et cetera, et cetera. And there's initiative to try to make the vaccine label information barcoded so that it includes that level of information so that in the future, when we do these type of studies, we're able to tease that out. And in order to as each time you subdivide, then the sample size gets becoming more and more challenging. And that's what I said earlier today about that we're really only in the beginning of the era of large data sets where hopefully you could start to harmonize the databases for multiple studies. And there's actually an initiative underway. Helen there may want to comment on it to try to get more national vaccine safety database linked together so we could start to answer these type of questions that you just raised.
There's a lot of safety science that's needed, and without the good science, we can't have good communication. So although I'm talking about all these other contextual issues and communication issues, it absolutely needs the science as the backbone. You can't repurpose the same old science to make it sound better if you don't have the science that's relevant to the new problems. So we need much more investment in safety science.
Vaccines are very safe. If someone gets sick after vaccination, it is usually either a coincidence, an error in administering the vaccine, or very rarely a problem with the vaccine itself. That's why we have vaccine safety systems. Robust vaccine safety systems allow health workers and experts to react immediately to any problems that may arise. They can examine the problem rigorously and scientifically, look at the data, and then promptly address the problem. WHO works closely with countries to make sure that vaccines can do what they do best: prevent disease without risks. New vaccines against malaria, meningitis, and encephalitis in Asia and Africa are now being thoroughly monitored with support from WHO. Vaccines are one of the safest tools we have to prevent disease and ensure a healthy future for all children. I think we cannot overemphasize the fact that we really don't have very good safety monitoring systems in many countries, and this adds to the miscommunication and the misapprehensions because we're not able to give clear-cut answers when people ask questions about the deaths that have occurred due to a particular vaccine, and this always gets blown up in the media. One should be able to give a very factual account of what exactly has happened and what the cause of deaths are. But in most cases, there's some obfuscation at that level, and therefore there's less and less trust then in the system. Putting in place the mechanisms, whether they're cohort studies or whether they're sentinel surveillance sites, to be able to monitor what's going on and report back, and then for corrective action to be taken, because unexpected things could arise after introduction, and one always has to be prepared. As we've seen, in the history of many drugs, you've learned about adverse events only after the drug's been licensed and introduced into the population. So I think that risk is always there, and the population needs to understand that and feel confident that mechanisms are being put in place to study some of those things.